Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Chad Koulis. I'm Executive Director of the Midway Chamber of Commerce. This is our March Economic Development meeting with a big topic, rent control, and a very big special guest, Mayor Melvin Carter. And I am actually going to turn it over to our moderator today. He is a part of our Economic Development Committee. He is a part of our board. He is a public affairs strategist with his own company, and he also does a lot of work with Thunheim Partners. Please welcome Emmett Coleman.
Well, good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I doubt anyone in attendance today needs much in the way of history regarding the rent control referendum. I assume we can all agree that few issues have caused greater confusion in St. Paul than its approval by voters last fall. Searching my memory, in fact, I cannot think of any policies that have had such an immediate impact on the overall confidence and willingness to invest in the city. To highlight this, I'll share just one quick statistic. Housing Link, a nonprofit organization focused on increasing affordable rental housing, noted in a report regarding rental housing affordability that where Minneapolis saw a nearly 40% increase in the average price per unit of apartment sales year over year, in St. Paul, that same value dropped by 25%. It's hard to process the implications of this data. Prior to the pandemic, the Twin Cities already faced a lack of new housing development and an increasingly unaffordable cost of existing housing, particularly for people of color. This is the very problem that led to the rent control referendum in the first place. But the trajectory is not sustainable if St. Paul and the region are to be economically competitive. While the City Council is currently considering implementation ordinances and a budget, we likely remain months away from specific recommendations stemming from the mayor's recently appointed 41-member committee or active debate around potential changes such as exempting new construction. In the meantime, Mayor, we're very grateful to have you here with us today to help us better understand the rent control issue and how we successfully navigate the challenges ahead. Just a few housekeeping things. The mayor has been gracious enough to join us today, but we know that he has a prior commitment at the bottom of the hour, so he will provide some comments and hopefully answer some questions. And Melanie and John with his staff will continue to engage and take questions for the remainder of our time. Would also remind everybody towards that end that there is a chat function. As you have questions, please feel free to submit the questions in the chat, and Chad and I will do our best to kind of curate those questions and keep the conversation going. Now on to the guests. Mayor Melvin Carter. Mayor needs very little introduction. He's a good friend and a fourth-generation St. Paul resident. He's the city's 46th mayor, and during his time in office, he's been focused on equity agenda in particular, from raising the minimum wage to ensuring that every child born in St. Paul has an incentive to consider college one day. Joining the mayor are two members of his staff, Melanie McMahon and John Grebner. Melanie is the executive project lead for the redevelopment of the city, focused on 8 major projects that include the Ford site, Sears, Central Station, River Center ramp, Hillcrest, Snelling Midway, River's Edge, and Boyce Totem Town. Previously, many of you may remember Melanie, who used to serve as council member Tolbert's aide. John is the political director in Mayor Carter's office and has been actively working on the rent control issue. Prior to joining the administration, John worked at AFSCME as a political organizer. Mayor, Melanie, and John, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Mayor, if you'd grace us with some comments and take a few questions, we would really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. First, I'll say, Emmett, you're not my first Coleman of the day here today. I actually just bumped into one of your brothers.
Sorry about that.
At the Highland, no, not that brother. No, I'm just kidding. So it's great to see everybody, and I appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. This is an important conversation. It is maybe the most important conversation that we have to have in St. Paul, alongside the critical public safety conversation that we're having right here in St. Paul and across the nation. The pandemic impacted us in every single way. It would be impossible, as all of you I know, to overstate the impacts of the pandemic on community life. Two of the significant impacts that it had across the country, and certainly right here in St. Paul, is that it brought with us an increase in violent crime that we are working diligently to address. And right here in St. Paul, within literally just the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, we saw a tenfold increase in the number of residents in our community who experience unsheltered homelessness. We hear from our teachers in our public schools. We hear from teachers in our public schools about students who switch schools literally 5-6 times in one school year because that's how housing insecure their families are. They move that many times. That, as we all know, that's an incredible interruption of a child's education. But we also have to remember that's an incredible interruption of 6 whole classrooms of education for all of our children in our community, even the ones who are stably housed and are not experiencing that type of housing insecurity. We see ourselves in the midst of significant housing shortage and housing challenges. And I'll tell you, at the center of this conversation around rent stabilization is what I think is a false paradox, is a notion that addressing the housing inequity and the extreme housing disparities that we've seen in our city requires us to forfeit the type of macroeconomic housing growth that we know that we need for our city to be successful. My first hope with regard to all this is that we don't fall for that trick. I don't think that those goals of expanding access to housing, of expanding our housing growth, of building more housing has to be mutually exclusive with our goal of ensuring that all of our children and all of our families in all corners of our city have access to affordable housing. So as we think about the ordinance that was passed by voters this past fall, we have to grapple with the fact that our voters, our community members have said they want a fundamentally different approach to housing in our community. I was in a conversation recently at the state capitol, and one of the senators sort of challenged me on the notion of the supply and demand curve and how this ordinance impacts the supply and demand curve. I reminded him that graph, if you remember, it essentially just looks like an X, and it looks like dots and lines. But on the demand curve, every spot on that curve below the dot is a family that does not have access to housing, is a family that doesn't know where they and their children are gonna sleep tonight. And the exhortation that I brought into the conversation, frankly, was that where housing is concerned, where the ability to just have a safe place to sleep is concerned. And I'll tell you, I'm particularly sensitive to this because I'm the mayor of a city that last winter lost 5 lives purely because those 5 individuals did not have a warm place to sleep. And my exhortation for our community is that where housing is concerned, we need a higher law than the law of supply and demand. Now we have to pay attention to those laws. We have to pay attention to those macroeconomic and microeconomic principles and make sure that we understand all of those things. And as I look back at the conversation we had around rent stabilization last summer, one, I lament the all or nothing approach that we took to that conversation. And that's one of the things that me and my team are intent on guiding our city out of. Two, I reflect on some of the concerns that I heard from many of you that said, look, we understand that something has to change. We understand that, that kind of basic supply and demand kind of approach to housing leaves families by definition homeless and, out of luck. But this policy really kind of goes too far. I'll acknowledge to you the policy is not the policy that would have came out of a process that my team and I are working in partnership with the city council had endeavored. I'll tell you, one of the things that I don't like about policy making through referendum by a vote is that, I've shared this last year a bit, is that, I've been making policy for quite a long time, and every policy that I've ever written, the first draft was wrong and needed amendment. The process of policy making by referendum sort of locks in that rough draft. And whereas the city council process we have access to has a first reading and a second reading and a third reading and a public hearing and many of opportunities to create kind of an iterative improvement process, locking in a policy by referendum really does not give that same opportunity. We've learned a lot. And again, one of the things that I heard from folks last winter or last summer was it's not sort of the baby in the bathwater. It's more that this policy has some aspects to it that feel like they extend too far in a way that could have the opposite effect than its desired goals. I agree with that, which is why my team and I have been working very closely with the city council and very diligently over the past several months to say, one, we obviously have a May 1st deadline to meet. That was in the language passed by voters, with a May 1st implementation deadline. So we're working quickly now to be able to kind of meet that deadline and be able to start implementing. And while the ordinance cannot be repealed within 1 year, it can absolutely be amended. There's been some conversation, a weird sort of rumor that has floated that sort of has pretended that this ordinance cannot be amended ever. And I remind folks that if that's the case, it's probably the first such law in our American democracy. The point of democracy is to amend over time. The point of democracy is to improve over time. And of course, even our US Constitution is written to be amended. So of course, our city code can be amended as well. We're working with the city council to do that. My first commitment to our public has been that I believe that has to include an exemption for new housing construction. Every single city in the country that has a rent control policy in place that we can find has an exemption for new housing construction. When I say that, some people love to jump up and say, oh, you're doing that for developers, or you're doing that for this person, or you're doing that to do that person a favor. The bottom line truth is that if our goal, and I believe it really is all of our goal, is for families to be able to live with affordability and sustainability in our community, that simply cannot be sustained in a city that has an extreme shortage of housing. We already have a shortage of housing. We have numbers from the county that suggest St. Paul needs about 11,000 more units for deeply affordable units for our lowest income families. We also have information from the state demographer that says that our city is nearing an all-time high population right now and got 2 decades of growth on the horizon. So failing to meet that growth would be catastrophic for our community. The fortunate thing is we have an enormous amount of opportunity to meet it from Highland Park, from the Highland Bridge site on the western end of the city to Hillcrest Golf Course on the eastern side of the city. And all throughout our city, we have enormous opportunities for economic development and demand for housing in our community has never been higher. Anybody who spends any time on a real estate site knows that or a rental site knows that anytime a unit of housing becomes available in our city, there's our people who are interested and eager to move in our city because they recognize the high quality of life that can be found here. That's something that's really important. And I want to make sure that we get a chance to continue to build, continue to grow, continue to expand our tax base, continue to expand our capacity to support families in our community with high quality housing options. And that, I believe, requires an exemption for new housing construction. At the same time as we're moving that forward, we move forward a stakeholder group that Emmett mentioned as well. This stakeholder group is designed to be a diverse group of people from literally every part of the circle of stakeholders around this issue to help bring us recommendations on sort of the long-term policy that we should be approaching. I think we have enormous questions that we have to answer together as a community. One of the things that I hope you've heard me say before is when we make big changes, we have to do them with big groups of people to make sure that they reflect the ambitions of our community. I think we have questions like, what about the impacts on kind of small mom and pop landlords? Is 3% a long-term kind of goal, or is it a starting point for us to talk about? We have questions like, how do we define a reasonable rate of return? We have questions like, what about properties that are already subject to some type of policy or contract inflicted rent kind of control mechanisms in place, and different things like that I think we have to work through as a community. Again, we've brought workers and renters and property owners developers, landlords to this table, around the table. One of the things I'm proud of about St. Paul, we've demonstrated that we can build that minimum wage policy that Emmett described earlier by bringing Chamber of Commerce leaders and union leaders to the same table to work it out. We've demonstrated that we can craft our community first public safety framework by bringing the police union president to the same table as Black Lives Matter advocates. I'm not sure that every city in America can do that, but we've demonstrated that we're the kind of city that can. And in just the same vein, I'm convinced that we'll be able to demonstrate that we're a city where renters and landlords and workers and developers can sit down at the same table and craft a policy approach that allows for families to live with dignity and stability in our city. From my perspective, that process never ends. I believe this should be a long-term group. One of the things that we're asking that stakeholder group to do is bring us recommendations for how to form sort of a more permanent group. My hope is that the policy we need 10 years from now is fundamentally different than the policy that works for St. Paul today, because we've had the impact that we want to have in our community. So that's something that's really important. In the meantime, again, I mentioned the May 1st deadline, and this is where I'll stop. And I'm happy to take any questions, but I wanted you to have sort of the landscape here before we started the conversation. We're working quickly towards the May 1st deadline. We have to be able to accept kind of requests from both landlords and renters. We have to be able to process those requests and get answers back to folks on a timely basis to ensure this is something that helps to facilitate and not hinder increased housing options and increased housing stability for our for low-income renters. We have to recognize and know, and this may be an unpopular thing to say, but in the same way as our community members cannot be safe unless our police officers are safe, in the same way as which a minimum wage doesn't do us very much good in a city that doesn't have a very strong business environment. In the same way, supporting renters requires our ability to hear from landlords, to hear from developers, to hear from property owners, and ensure that we're building a city that works for all of us together, because we are all, know it or not, like it or not, part of this same sort of economic ecosystem that has to work for all of us or it won't work for any of us. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Look forward to answering any questions. I've got Melanie McMahon, who's our executive project lead for the city of St. Paul, who has taken the leadership of this work, of sort of the grand work, our grand work team that's working on all things rent stabilization. So she is here to answer questions, as well as John Grebner, who has been one of the staff members who's taken the lead with organizing and facilitating the stakeholder group, along with the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. So I may phone a friend for if any questions are require a very specific answer. But again, happy to take any questions and really appreciative of the opportunity to join the conversation today.
Thank you, Mayor, for putting a lot of the context around it, because I think it's essential that we do think about the solutions going forward in the context. We can't escape that, and I love the way that you frame that. We hope that whatever the solutions look like in 10 years, they're very different because they've been affected positively with what work we're doing now. I guess let me, while we're hoping that others will throw some questions up in the chat, let me toss out for you just a question around timeline. So when the May 1st is implementation of the ordinance, and that's already in the process right now. You guys are working on that budget and other things, as I mentioned. You talked about the context of not being able to amend the ordinance, and I think hopefully we all agree it can be and will be amended and corrected at some point. But you talk about the timeline a little differently than I hear other people. So could you give us just a sense of when do you expect the conversation, the debate to happen about like exempting new development? And are you waiting on your 41-member committee to come back with some solutions before you put forward a proposal? And I guess just tie that in a bow is, do you think that timeline is sooner than 1 year from the deadline around, as some people have suggested, around amending the ordinance?
Thanks for the question. You're right. There's a 1 year deadline. There is absolutely a 1 year deadline. The ordinance cannot be repealed within 1 year of passage. There is little, if any, case law that delves into where the line is between repeal and amended. I think there's agreement that it cannot be sort of substantively amended in a way that sort of changes the, or reverses the effect of the policy within 1 year. And so that's something that's on the table there. I'm in pretty regular contact with developers in our community. And one of the things that I hear from them is that if they could hear from me, they already have, as well as the city council, that we have the intent and agreement to provide an exemption for new housing construction, that would help them have conversations with their funders and the folks who they need to process the funding and the financing for the projects of literally thousands of units in our city that are on pause, that I'm told we can get going again, get moving again, once we send that clear signal that the city council and I are working together to ensure that we're passing an exemption for new housing construction. I expect to be able to say that alongside, I said actually before Election Day last year, and again right after Election Day last year, that I believe this policy needs an exemption for new housing construction, again, like every other city in America that has a rent stabilization policy in place. I expect within very soon to be able to stand forward with the city council and send that signal together. So I think that'll be a major milestone for us. I think the city council and I are both looking to the stakeholder group to provide some of those larger kind of recommendations. And again, one of the reasons I have not asked the stakeholder group if there should be an exemption for new housing construction is because I believe I already know where my position is on that there should be. And I think it would be inauthentic to ask a question that we already know the answer to. And so it may be, I would love to see the city council, frankly, take action on, we've drafted a new housing construction exemption ordinance. I'd love to see the city council take action on that. The draft that we provided them, I believe has a January 1st, 2023 implementation date, but that has a 15-year look back. So anything that's been constructed in the past 15 years from that date would have an exemption from the policy, obviously, until it reaches its 15th birthday of receiving their certificate of occupancy from the state. I would love to see us take action on that now. It may be, again, in a way that says it's, it goes into effect at the end of the year. It may be that we end up waiting for the sort of grand round of recommendations to be in place so that we can do one grand amendment at some point in time. My hope is and expectation would be before the end of this year to to coincide with that 1 year anniversary of the passage as quickly as possible. But it may be that we end up doing that all as one kind of action. But I do expect to be able to say alongside the city council together very soon that to tell the city, to tell the developers who work in it, the renters who live in it, the families who are interested in moving here, and certainly the finance folks who are interested in underwriting projects so that we can keep constructing housing in our city, that the city council and I are in agreement that this policy moving forward must include an exemption for new housing construction. I see a question about vacancy decontrol. I think that's a real question that we have to ask. It's one of the questions that we've put in front of our stakeholder group. And it's something that I'm very open to having the conversation about. Frankly, it's something that I've asked my staff a lot of questions about, but really want to understand more through the lens of all the different people that we've brought together in this circle around that stakeholder group, so that we can come up with kind of a final thing. I said to the city council, I said to the public, I think I said in my State of the City address that I'm pretty much open to any suggestion except the all or nothing sort of space, and accept the notion that the city council, the mayor, we can do that we're powerless to help craft this policy moving forward.
Mayor, want to thank you for your time. I know you're going to have to run at the bottom of the hour, but maybe if we could just ask one quick question. I say quick, but John Young, who's an industrial real estate broker, I'm sure you know John, was asking a more cumulative question, which I think would be more appropriate for you than for Melanie or John, which is, in talking to other businesses, there's a cumulative effect of minimum wage, rent control, other issues going on. And I think that what John was asking is just, is this something that your team is discussing of how do you take these these substantial investments in the community and these progressive agendas, but cumulatively look at what the impact is and what message it sends?
Absolutely, and I think it sends many messages. I mean, frankly, we would prefer minimum wage and some of these other types of policies that we've built to be statewide and federal policies, so that they didn't set St. Paul apart in the way that they do. One of the things that I think I've learned traveling the city and just listening to community members and listening to our residents is that our traditional approaches to city building, which center around a public safety strategy that's, I think, borrowed from the Wild Wild West. It's about searching town for like the quote unquote bad guys and rooting them out, and searching the country for promise and potential, and essentially writing checks to get people to move here from Minneapolis or Wisconsin or Miami or wherever. It leads us in a vicious cycle of betting against our own residents, of identifying only problems within our community, and only identifying promise and potential outside of our community. And that's something that our community members don't like and resent when we do that. And so this is all a part of an effort that I think of as like betting on us, betting on ourselves. Our commitment that I made when I first got sworn in 4 years ago, and re-upped in my inaugural address in January of this year, is that we're going to take every chance that we can to invest in the limitless potential that exists right here in our community, and particularly the underinvested potential that exists in many of our lower income and communities of color. And that really centers around making sure that this is a city where people can live with dignity, where people can participate in the economy. As we talk about equity, our guiding principle on equity in our office comes from when I was in business school and undergraduate, where it wasn't a social justice word at all, it was a money word. The word equity described shares of ownership. It described decision-making power, and it described the ability to participate in an economy. If I own equity in a company that has a good quarter, then I had a good quarter too. And one of the things that our equity work demands is our ability to tell folks in our community that as our macro economy in this city grows, we're going to find ways to make it easier to pay the rent. That's a commitment of ours. And I believe that the long-term effect on our city will be overwhelmingly positive. All of this is about the essential workers that we relied on during a pandemic, being able to afford to have a place to live in our community. All of this is about producing more consumers in our community that can, shop at our stores, that can live in our apartment buildings, that can go to a game and, buy things for their children and participate in our local economy. And that, I think, is an important thing for us. You're right. I think there's a balance in all of those things to be able to navigate those things. And that's certainly a conversation we have very closely and carefully in our office and in partnership with our city council as well.
Thank you for that. I want to be respectful. We were told we had to cut you loose, and I spent too many years as staff to not take that order seriously. But if you can stick with us, we certainly would love to have you.
Take a couple more minutes. So if there's questions that are if you're seeing questions that are particularly for me, a lot of the smart questions I'll leave to Melanie and John. I'm sure I could answer them all, but I don't want to waste their time either.
Yeah, it did feel like maybe some of the deeper dive ones we'll save for them.
Sure.
I'm just looking.
I've got one here from one of the participants, Emmett. Somebody had sent me a question. Would the mayor consider exempting existing properties, parentheses, mom and pops, subject to a change in ownership? If not, will property conditions suffer due to lack of investment?
Would we subject to a change in ownership?
Yep.
Did you understand that?
I'm not sure. Go ahead. What were you going to say, Emmett?
Well, I was just going to clarify. I think it means kind of like the issue with renters changing, that the tax wouldn't, the restraint wouldn't apply until somebody sold like their duplex or whatever. They wouldn't have it now. It would be for the next. Is that correct, Chad? Does that sound right?
That's what my guess is. I'm assuming they're meaning to grandfather in if you have an existing relationship currently with a smaller landlord.
Got it. That's not something I've anticipated. Like I said, I would entertain any recommendation. I'll entertain any recommendation that comes from our stakeholder group. That's not something I've anticipated. We've had a larger conversation around the possibility of like a vacancy decontrol sort of thing. One of the questions really is how we think about ensuring that we're doing the property maintenance and upkeep that we need to do in our community. And that's one of the questions, you know, we need to make sure that we have policies that don't disincentivize upkeep, disincentivize property improvements and maintenance. And that is something that we are asking the stakeholder group for recommendations on. I'm not specifically entertaining or evaluating any specific proposal at this time around sort of, you know, exempting every property that's, you know, until it changes hands of ownership. That would probably be a pretty substantive undermining of what our voters, of what over 30,000 voters came to the polls to say that they wanted to see happen in St. Paul last November.
Makes sense. Mayor Don Zuge, who's one of the small landlords in town, has asked the question, which I think is particularly relevant given what we're seeing in the news every day about inflation and the increasing challenge across the country on everything from gas and groceries. But is there any connection being looked at in terms of guidance to the 41-member committee or others to peg the rent control issue in the future to inflation rather than having a set number that may not be reflective of actual increasing costs?
It's a good question. Yes, that's one of the things I said earlier is, you know, I think, you know, the ordinance as drafted last year, as passed last year, just has sort of a hard 3% number. It also includes a acknowledgement that landlords should be able to receive a reasonable rate of return. At some level, you know, receiving a year-over-year reasonable rate of return we may find that it by definition pulls back in inflation. Those are some of the types of questions, though, that we have our stakeholder group kind of tackling and addressing. Melanie and John, would you add, what would you add to that answer?
Melanie, did you want to start?
Nope, I was going to defer to you.
For sure.
Stakeholder group involvement.
Okay, so at a recent stakeholder conversation, there was a conversation related to what those caps are. And one of the things that folks were exploring was about inflation and elements in other existing policies where inflation is an underlying component before you even get to a cap. And so some of them would say CPI plus X%. Inflation plus X%. It was also a conversation related to other elements of exceptions and presumably in today's conversation, talking a bit around administration. I also know that it's among the topics that is talked about related to reasonable return as well.
Emmett, I'm getting told I better jump, but you guys are in more than capable hands with Melanie and John, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. It will be ongoing. Like I said, I know there are folks, you know, within you know, the business and chamber circles who are a part of our stakeholder group. We'll definitely be kind of looking to engage folks every chance that we get. And you know, what I've said earlier on this call, what I've said to the city council, what I said in my State of the City address continues to remain true. This is a space where I believe that we can work together to find a common sense approach, to find the approach that works best for St. Paul, to find the approach that learns lessons learned, you know, that takes advantage of lessons learned in other places around the city, and that ensures that our children and families can live with dignity and stability and sustainability in our community. And so I appreciate you all plugging into the conversation. I know it's a challenging conversation, and it's better because you're plugging into it. So thank you very much. And sorry, I got to jump off.
Thank you, Mayor. We really
All right.
appreciate your taking time for us today and for your helping us kind of lead through this issue.
Absolutely. Thanks all. Bye.
Take care. Melanie and John, tag. You're it now. So just back up a little bit in some of the questions here as I'm trying to peruse through them. But one of the very kind of early questions was also just, what is the cost for St. Paul in terms of the monitoring and compliance that you're anticipating right now on an annualized basis?
Speak a little bit to that. Actually, last week at the City Council, there was a budget resolution related to the rent stabilization ordinance, and it held a public hearing, heard comments from folks about that, and it did pass the City Council last week. That budget resolution specifically related to the implementation of this ordinance funded 5 different positions in the city. It funded 2 positions in the City Council office, 2 positions in the Department of Safety and Inspections, which will take the primary lead come that May 1st date for the ordinance, and then 1 position in the city attorney's office. And so that budget resolution included that with some, all of those positions, as well as some, additional outreach.
Thank you. Just a question from Jay Bloomgart, which is, as you guys are looking at you're having the conversations with stakeholders here, you've got the committee, you're talking to council members. Are there examples in other communities across the country where you are looking to study how the St. Paul ordinance can be most effectively tweaked to achieve that balance that the mayor spoke about earlier?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a bit about that. So starting in very late February, the stakeholders group started getting together. That's the 41 members of the stakeholders group that the mayor had mentioned earlier. And among the things that they've been doing is taking a look at 5 component parts of rent stabilization policies across the country. So that's taking a look at rent caps, control, decontrol, exemptions, exceptions, and then also administration. So implementation of policies like this. And they've taken a look at various ways that those look in varying parts of the country. Part of that is just to get a grounding in what those component parts of rent stabilization policies are, setting up the stakeholders for the opportunity to connect together and looking for that St. Paul way forward that Mayor Carter had mentioned. And so right now there's a lot of learning and a great ability for folks in the community to do some of the learning along with members of the stakeholder group. And then in the coming weeks, there's also going to be an opportunity for public engagement and feedback, where the stakeholder group will be taking some of the suggestions that I've seen in the chat and certainly that we've heard and that have been brought up as part of those stakeholder conversations already, and really get an opportunity to hear from folks in the community, maybe see which of those might be the component parts to really take a look at first in St. Paul, and then work together to put together a report with considerations to deliver to the mayor and the city council for how this policy might look in the future.
So John and Melanie, one of the things the mayor spoke about was not asking the committee to look at the context of exempting new development, including grandfathering backwards to 15 years. I've seen a question or two in the chat about the context of existing buildings 10 years old. Can you guys explain that a little bit? Because I think that's a little bit confusing, but the way I understood it, that if you built something, you've invested in the last 15 years, the way the mayor's office has currently been talking about this is you would have a 15-year shot clock. And so if you did something 5 years ago, you'd have 10 more years. If you did something 11 years ago, you'd have 4 more years. Can you explain that a little bit better? Because I'm not sure I've captured that correctly, and I think it's confusing.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to chat about that a little more. The mayor's actually drafted an amendment to the ordinance that would exempt new residential construction, and he's already passed that along to the city council members for their consideration. As he indicated earlier, he supports that, and looking around in other rent stabilization ordinances in the country, everyone that we found has in some form an exemption for new residential construction. So the proposal drafted by the mayor, Emmett, to your point, it is a 15-year exemption, and it is 15 years dated from the first building permit, from the first certificate of occupancy. And so from that first certificate of occupancy, you have 15 years that you're exempt from that 3% cap. So if, exactly as you had stated before, if that first C of O was 5 years ago, it's 15 years from that first C of O, meaning you would have then 10 years left on that exemption, with the idea and the understanding being that to finance, to build, and to really add the new additional residential units that we need in our community, that's about the right period of time for that to work out to obtain that financing.
Thank you. I'm just noticing a comment pop up that some suggest that 15 years isn't enough. So again, what I think I just heard you suggest was that some of the early research you've been doing is that's a period of time you guys feel comfortable making that line, obviously.
It is. And if you look at other communities across the country, some have exemptions as short as 5 years and some go as long as 30 years. So it really depends on the community. And in talking to developers in our community and looking at it, 15 years was the appropriate time, we felt.
So going back, I talked a little bit about inflation, but Andy Silberud here is asking the question about the double-digit property tax increases that have kind of been seen in St. Paul the last couple of years, often paid by landlords and passed down to tenants. With the 3% cap, would property tax qualify under the reasonable return exemption, or is property tax likely to be not one of those considerations on return?
Sure, I can address a little bit of that. So the ordinance as drafted and as passed by the voters does allow for a reasonable rate of return, and it gives 7 factors as drafted in the ordinance to use for consideration when determining that. And so a lot of this is that there's a lot of detail and there's a lot of nuance and a lot of great questions regarding that. So in order to implement and move forward towards that May 1st date that was given in the ordinance, the Department of Safety and Inspections, we anticipate, would engage in a rulemaking process. And so likely in April, they would put forward more detailed and specific rules regarding the consideration of those factors in looking at reasonable rate of return. And so the rulemaking would allow for them to publicly put out there, here are the rules, here's how we are going to implement with the ordinance language, again, as drafted and passed. That's the constraints we have on May 1st. And then that would be open for public comment and consideration, and then they'd be able to hear back from community on that before publishing those final rules.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do a quick moderator prerogative here, but I want to ask a question. Just to go back to the Housing Link report, that's data coming in from Met Council. You've already got a reduction in the first year in terms of the value of apartment sales per unit. We know there's been a number of developers that have kind of pulled out of projects or slowed down. I've heard anecdotally of late that the Planning Commission hasn't been seeing the number of new projects coming forward that they traditionally see. As you guys start to think about this impact, whether it's 1 year or it's 2 or 3 years, how does the mayor kind of, I guess, view this in the contemplation overall money that the city will have available to invest? I mean, TIF, just as an example, is dependent on those new revenues coming in, and at some point, does it become a little bit of I don't know what the right phrase is for that, but at some point it seems like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we don't have enough affordable housing because we can't invest in more affordable housing because we put up rules that slow down investment in housing. I'm not sure which one of you wants to address that, but it just feels like at some point it's going to put us further behind for at least some period of time. And has there been discussion of that?
It's going to defer to John on that.
I think that's part of the conversation that led to the mayor's proposal related to a new construction exemption, is just knowing that there are more folks looking to live in St. Paul than there are areas available, and that that it is important that we make sure that we're doing that we also have a stakeholders group that is going to be able to take a look at additional components to this, so that we're able to find that St. Paul way forward. I also understand that there are varying folks have looked at varying considerations related to what their portfolios look like, and so I'm not sure that we've really seen a whole lot of data come forward related to that, so much as heard anecdotally about a number of those items. So I think as the year progresses, and I think as we get more certainty related to what St. Paul's policy is, we'll start to see what the impact is.
And I'll just add that exactly to that point that John made, that there's a lot of nuance in every determination made. You know, every builder moving forward with a project has a lot of different, very unique things about that project that factor into it moving forward. It depends, you know, when they started and all sorts of things. And so it's hard to make any sort of carte blanche statement about any one policy having a universal impact.
Yeah, I also just wanted to say thank you so much. Melanie and I do have to head off to get ready for the stakeholders conversation that is live streamed today starting at 1 p.m. until 3 p.m. And Chad had mentioned that he'd be collecting additional questions and sending them to us so that we'll be able to take a look at those and be able to answer as many of those as we're able to. Also encourage you to participate or watch the City Council's meeting tomorrow, where they're going to be taking a look at the definitions and the administrative ordinance that has the implementation for May 1st, going to the Department of Safety and Inspections.
Well,
So a lot going on.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Well, listen, and I'll let Chad wrap us up, but deeply appreciate your both of you being with us today and taking some time to questions. We wish you good luck with both the stakeholder group coming up this afternoon and the conversations going forward. I know we will be watching closely, and I know we look forward to continued engagement with you guys. I think there's probably a lot more questions to come, but with that, thank you very much. I'll turn it back to Chad.
Thanks, Emmett. And, you know, we do have a little bit of time before 1 o'clock, so I'm hoping we can continue having the conversation going here. I want to just get more feedback and input from people. And Maya, I saw that your hand was up. Did you want to start us off?
Well, I just a curiosity or commentary here is that there's a lot of suggestions that the stakeholders group is going to answer questions. We have to remember there's 41 people in that group and the conversation is quite divisive. So for us to just say the stakeholders are going to figure that out, we need to understand, and I encourage people to tune in, that this is not a group that's just got all the answers, and it's certainly not a group that's even listening to each other yet. So it's not a perfect answer yet.
And Maya is a part of that stakeholders group, so she's very familiar with it. I know that there was a couple of questions in the chat about the stakeholders group, when they meet, when it's available. Maya, are you okay to answer a couple of those questions?
Yeah, you can log in. It's a live conversation, so they're being recorded as well. But you can tune in about 9 more minutes and follow all the fun on that side of things as well.
Thank you, Maya. I just want to open it up. We have the questions in the chat, and we've got those recorded. We're going to be sending those to the mayor's office, and hopefully can get answers on anything they haven't answered yet. But we're here. A lot of you have strong opinions on this. I'd just like to hear if you can just raise your hand, and I'll call on you, or Emmett will call on you. We just want to hear a little bit more, and we've got a lot of people that care a lot about this topic right here and are very knowledgeable about rental properties. So it'd be good to just to kind of wrap this up with a conversation amongst us.